"There's no Renfro on this list," the volunteer said, and said it a second time to the man beside her, as if the paper might change its mind if she read it aloud twice. A strap Floyd Renfro kept buttoned inside his jacket, its stamped marks never explained, pressed flat against his chest while he waited for her to look up. Beside him, on a loose lead gone soft with age, a gray-muzzled shepherd named Alder sat without being told to, the way he always did at gates, at doors, at the ends of things. Nobody had asked Floyd why he carried what he carried. Nobody had asked him much of anything in 35 years, and today looked set to keep that streak alive, because the volunteer folded her clipboard against her stomach and told him, not unkindly, but not kindly either, that he and the dog would need to watch from outside the rope line. Behind her, 20 feet off under the foundation's new vinyl arch, Prescott Havermeyer was mid-laugh, with a man in a blazer the color of a bank lobby. The two of them angled toward a coffee cart, like it was a photo opportunity. Havermeyer had a printed run sheet rolled in one hand, and he tapped its corner twice against his palm before he pitched his voice just loud enough to carry. "Every year," he said, "we get a stray or two who wanders the fence line hoping for a free program. Today, we got a stray that wandered in with a stray." The blazer laughed on cue. Elise Beaumont, who managed the guest list and the stage timing, and, on a day like this, the small emergencies nobody printed on a run sheet, glanced over with the particular weariness of someone who had heard her director make this joke before, at other gates, about other names. If you've ever watched an animal recognize someone before the room caught up, you already know how this field is about to go quiet. Floyd didn't answer the joke, and he didn't answer the volunteer either, not right away. He turned his whole body toward her instead of just his head, a slow, economical pivot, because his left shoulder had not lifted past his collarbone in 11 years, and turning was cheaper than reaching. It made him look, to a stranger, like a man arriving at a decision. He was only arriving at a sentence. "Renfro," he said, "R-E-N-F-R-O, try it under the handler's roster instead of the guest list." The volunteer's eyes went down the page again, dutiful, and came back up with the same flat result. Elise stepped in before the moment could curdle further, asked for identification with the practiced gentleness of someone smoothing a corner that had snagged before, and Floyd produced a driver's license gone soft at the fold, and nothing else. Because whatever else might have proven what he was, had never once been written down where a clipboard could find it. "I'm sorry," Elise said, and seemed to mean it. "If you're not on either list, I can't let you inside the rope for the ceremony. You're welcome to stand along the fence. The dog's fine there too, long as he's leashed." Alder's tail moved once against the gravel, unbothered, patient as weather. Floyd nodded the way a man nods at a forecast he's heard before and doesn't argue with, and stepped back from the gate to the place where the grass gave over to fence wire, and stood there in the morning sun, with his dog, on the outside of a field that, though nobody at that gate would have believed it, he had walked long before any of them were born. The jacket Floyd wore had been built for deer season 30 winters back, canvas gone the color of a dry creek bed, its lining torn along one seam and stitched again with waxed thread by a hand that had learned to sew from a mother who kept chickens. Underneath it, incongruous and correct at once, he wore the collar and slacks of church clothes, pressed the night before on a board set up in his kitchen, because a memorial was a kind of church, whether the program called it one or not. The combination fooled people, the way it was built to fool people, though Floyd had never built it on purpose. He had simply worn what he owned, in the order that made sense to him, for longer than most of the people at that gate had been alive. His left shoulder held itself at a fixed height, as though a shelf had been nailed there and he'd learned to live around it. He did not reach across himself for anything anymore. If a door was on his blind side, he turned his boots toward it first and let the rest of him follow, an economy of motion so old it no longer registered to him as a workaround. It registered to no one else either, mostly because no one watched him closely enough to notice a man rearranging his whole body to spare a joint that had quit rising sometime around his 67th birthday. Inside the jacket, buttoned against his shirt, the strap rode where a wallet might ride on another man. It was hand-tooled leather, dark with age and oil, stamped in a long, uneven row with tick marks, cut by a knife, not a machine, each one slightly different in depth and angle, the way a signature is never twice the same. He had made it as a muzzle guard once, decades back, before muzzle guards were something a catalog sold you. Now it was only a strap that lived against his heart and came out once a year, at this field, on this date, when he found a quiet corner and ran his thumb down the row and counted, though what exactly he was counting, he had never told a living soul, including Wanda, who had known enough not to ask twice. Alder moved beside him with the deliberate, unhurried gait of an old working dog who has nothing left to prove and no interest in pretending otherwise, his hips rolling slightly with each step, his nose working the ground less than it once had, and the air more, the way an animal reads a place rather than a scent. He'd been retired 9 years, and in dog years that made him an old man twice over, matched to the man holding his lead in a way that made strangers smile without knowing why. 12 summers on him now, and a working life behind those 12 that had taken him through kennels and transports, and one long, difficult year Floyd never discussed with anyone who hadn't been there. In the bed of Floyd's truck, parked at the edge of the gravel lot under a hackberry tree, sat a case of honey jars, capped and labeled in handwriting too careful to be anyone's but a woman, a long time gone. Wanda had kept the hives out past the workshop for 11 years, before her heart gave out on a Tuesday in March, quietly, in her sleep, the way she'd have wanted it if anyone had asked her preference, which nobody had, because nobody plans that conversation. Floyd had kept the hives running on her exact schedule every season since, same weeks for the split, same weeks for the harvest, same jars from the same supplier in the next county, and every year he brought a case of the honey wherever there were people who might want it, and every year he gave every last jar away and kept none for himself, because keeping it had never been the point. He didn't know yet that this particular case, riding in the truck bed under the hackberry, would end the day 1 jar lighter than it started, given not away exactly, but returned, in a manner of speaking, to a debt he hadn't known he was still owed. For now, he only stood at the fence with his dog and let the morning do what mornings do, watching through the gap in the crowd as the foundation's new director found his footing on a low stage and lifted a microphone like a man who had rehearsed the gesture in a mirror. Prescott Havermeyer had the kind of voice built for exactly this moment, pitched to carry over a coffee cart's hiss and a crowd's shuffle, warm at the edges, certain in the middle. He held his printed run sheet the way another man might hold notes he didn't need, more prop than reference, and he opened with a joke about the weather that landed the way jokes land when an audience has already decided to like the man telling them. "Folks, before the ceremony proper, I want to give our sponsors team a little of the history here," he said, angling toward the blazer and a woman beside him in foundation gray. Because Cutback Ridge didn't happen by accident. It happened because one man, back in the early years, built a training program from nothing and made it work. He tapped the sheet's corner against his palm, a habit as fixed as a metronome. The program's founding trainer, and I want to say his name today, because history's supposed to remember these things, was a fine, dedicated administrator by the name of Harmon Bale. Mr. Bale built the bones of what we do here. Everything after him is footnotes. The name went out over the crowd and settled there, accepted, unquestioned, the way names do when spoken with enough confidence by a man holding a microphone. At the rope line, 20 feet back, Floyd Renfro's face did not move, not in any way a stranger could have read as more than mild interest in a stranger's speech. But Alder, who had heard exactly one name mentioned in that whole run of talk that meant anything to him, leaned his shoulder harder into Floyd's leg, the pressure of an old dog checking on an old man, the way he'd once checked on him in places louder and worse than this. Austin Kirkendall, 26 and 3 years into logistics work he'd taken partly to be near dogs, and partly because his grandfather had never stopped talking about a program he called simply The Ridge, stood off to the side with a clipboard of his own, checking cable runs for the broadcast crew. He wasn't watching Havermeyer. He was watching the fence line, because something about the stillness there had caught his eye before the speech even started. An old man, standing straighter than his shoulder, wanted to let him, A dog, leaning in at exactly the moment a name was said that meant nothing to anyone else in that crowd. Havermeyer went on, warming further, listing dates that sounded right and were wrong by years, describing training methods in language that came from a report rather than from having ever run a dog through mud at 4 in the morning. Behal's methodology, he said, is the backbone of everything Cutback Ridge does today. It's why our naming rights partners are excited to be part of a legacy this clean. The Blazer nodded along, and Elise Beaumont, standing near the stage with her own clipboard, made a small mark beside a line item that had nothing to do with any of this, and everything to do with keeping the schedule from sliding. Floyd's jaw did not tighten. His hand, resting at his side, found the outline of the strap through his jacket without seeming to move at all, a gesture so slight it could have been mistaken for a man settling his coat against the wind. He said nothing. He had said nothing about this particular untruth for 15 years, ever since the day a folder somewhere had quietly decided a dead administrator made a cleaner story than a live enlisted man who'd asked, once, decades before that folder existed, to be left off every roster the program kept. He hadn't asked to be erased. He'd only asked to be left out of it, which was not the same request, though it had produced, over enough years and enough hands, the same result. Austin watched the old man's stillness, a beat longer than the speech deserved, and something about it snagged in him, the way a name half-remembered snags before it surfaces. He didn't know yet what he was looking at. He only knew, the way a junior handler learns to know before he can explain how he knows it, that the dog leaning into that man's leg was not comforting a stranger. Havermeyer wrapped his remarks with a flourish about legacy and looked pleased with himself in the particular way of a man who has just told a story he believes completely, which was, in its own way, the most dangerous kind of telling there is. The rehearsal for the procession began an hour later, dogs and handlers walking a slow loop around the drill field's inner track, while sound techs called levels into headsets and a stage manager paced off marks with white tape. 6 teams total, 3 units represented, the animals young by comparison to the morning's other business. The oldest handler present had maybe 8 years in, the youngest dog barely 3, still learning that a crowd of murmuring strangers was not, in fact, a threat requiring a response. It was that youngest dog, a lean Belgian Malinois named Rye, working with a handler no older than Austin, who began, 10 minutes into the loop, to lift his head at intervals that had nothing to do with command and everything to do with noise. A speaker feedback squeal here, a generator kicking on there, the crowd along the rope thickening as families arrived early to claim shade. Rye's ears kept swiveling, his stride shortening by degrees, so small his handler, focused on hitting his tape mark, didn't register the change at all. Floyd registered it from 40 feet off, outside the rope, with the particular attention of a man who has spent more hours than he could count, learning to see a dog's trouble before the dog fully knows it's in trouble himself. He watched Rye's tail carriage drop a half-inch. He watched the dog's weight shift rearward, subtle, a held-back lean that meant the animal was one loud noise away from a decision his handler wouldn't like. Floyd had seen that exact lean 100 times, on 100 different dogs, across 3 continents, and 24 years, and something in him that had never fully retired went quiet and attentive the way it always had. He didn't call out. Calling out would only add one more voice to the noise already working on the animal. Instead, he did something smaller, something that cost him nothing to offer and nothing to anyone if it was ignored. He crouched, slow and careful of his shoulder, lowering his whole frame rather than reaching, and he began, low under his breath, a run of 2-tone whistling so quiet it barely cleared the rope line. It wasn't a command. It wasn't anything Rye had ever been trained to answer. It was only a sound, steady and unbothered, the kind of sound an old handler makes without thinking, because some part of him is still standing in a kennel 40 years gone, calming a different dog on a different morning. Rye's ears found the sound before his handler found the problem. The dog's head turned, sought it, and something in his gait eased by degrees, the shortened stride lengthening back out, the tail carriage lifting a half-inch at a time until the animal was, to any observer not looking closely, simply walking a rehearsal loop like the other 5. Havermeyer, 20 yards off reviewing his run sheet with a producer, happened to glance up in time to see the tail lift and the stride correct, and he frowned, tapped the sheet's corner twice against his palm, and said, mostly to himself, "Huh," settled on its own, before returning to his notes. Coincidence was a word that cost him nothing, and explained everything he didn't want to look at further, and he spent it here, the way a man spends a coin he doesn't expect to need again. Austin, 20 feet from both of them, had watched the whole exchange without understanding the mechanism, only the shape of it, an old man at a fence, a low sound nobody else seemed to notice, a dog's fear draining out of him like water finding a lower place to sit. He didn't say anything either. He only wrote it down, mentally, in the growing ledger of things about this day that weren't adding up to the story he'd been told. The rehearsal wound down without further incident. The teams broke for water, the tape marks were checked and rechecked, and Floyd rose from his crouch with the careful, unhurried economy of a man whose knees required advance notice, and stood again at the rope with his hand resting, as it so often did without his seeming to notice, against the shape of the strap beneath his jacket. By the time the ceremony proper began, the field had filled past its rope lines twice over, families in folding chairs, a color guard standing at parade rest near the flagpole, and a live broadcast camera mounted on a riser with a red light that had been burning steady for the better part of an hour. Havermeyer stood near the stage in a suit that fit him the way confidence fits a man who has never been asked to defend it, and when the moment came for the memorial's centerpiece, the off-leash walk, 6 working dogs released from their handlers to cross the field, unaccompanied in honor of every animal the program had lost. He lifted his hand for the signal, with the satisfaction of a man cueing a piece of music he'd written himself. The dogs came off their leads clean, all 6 at once, and for the first several strides they did exactly what months of rehearsal had built them to do. A slow diagonal crossing, noses low, the crowd hushing the way crowds hush for things they've been told to consider sacred. Then, without any signal anyone on that field had given, all 6 dogs broke the line at once. It wasn't a stagger, one animal drifting and the others following out of habit. It was simultaneous. 6 trained working dogs from 3 separate units, turning as if a single hand had redirected them, crossing the rope in a scatter of loose gravel and startled handlers, and closing the distance to the fence, where an old man in a hunting jacket stood with his own retired shepherd at his side. They pressed against Floyd's legs, one after another, noses driving into his palms, shoulders leaning into his knees, the way Rye had leaned an hour before, only now in front of every camera the broadcast owned. Alder didn't move at all. He simply sat, already exactly where he wanted to be, watching the younger dogs arrive at a fact he'd known for years. The crowd's hush deepened into something else entirely. Not the practiced silence of a program cue, but the genuine, unrehearsed quiet of several hundred people watching an explanation arrive before anyone had spoken a word of it. Havermeyer's smile held for exactly as long as smiles hold when the man wearing them hasn't yet understood what he's looking at, and then, by careful and visible degrees, it did not. For the length of one long breath, nobody on that field, least of all the man holding the microphone, said anything at all, and the 6 dogs stood pressed against an old man's legs as if they had simply, finally, come home. Havermeyer recovered the way men like him always recover, which is to say, quickly, in words, before the silence could finish its work on him. He crossed to the edge of the stage, waved the handlers forward to reclaim their animals with a brisk, professional patience that cost him visible effort, and told the crowd, in the warm, carrying voice built for exactly this kind of repair, that dogs sometimes imprinted on unfamiliar scents during high-stress events, that it was a known behavioral phenomenon, nothing more, and that the ceremony would continue on schedule. The blazer beside him nodded along. The crowd, less certain, settled back into its rope lines with the particular restlessness of an audience that has been told to disbelieve what it just watched with its own eyes. Behind the stage, out of the broadcast camera's reach, Havermeyer pulled his laptop bag off a folding table and opened the behavioral monitoring log his own team had been running all morning. a program he'd insisted on personally, proud of the data stream, proud of how it would look in next quarter's grant report. He scrolled to the timestamp of the off-leash walk, meaning only to confirm his own explanation for his own peace of mind, and found instead that the 6 dogs' heart rate telemetry and directional sensors had logged their turn toward the fence a full 4 seconds before Floyd had so much as shifted his weight. 4 seconds in which the old man had done nothing. No whistle, no gesture, not even the low crouch he'd used on Rye during rehearsal. The data his own instruments had gathered contradicted the sentence he'd just said into a live microphone, and he stood there in the tense shade, reading it twice, the run sheet forgotten in his other hand, his thumb no longer tapping its corner against his palm at all. Elise Beaumont found him there a few minutes later, her own clipboard held against her chest, and asked only whether they needed to adjust the afternoon schedule. Havermeyer said no, too quickly, and closed the laptop before she could see the screen. Austin, meanwhile, had slipped into the Foundation's records trailer to pull the dedication wall's finalized text for the sign shop, a task Havermeyer had asked him to handle an hour before the off-leash walk had scrambled everyone's afternoon. The folder was labeled simply Founding History, Final Draft, and it took him only a few minutes of paging through it to notice what should have been obvious to him years ago, if anyone had ever thought to show him this particular drawer. Every document in the file credited the program's original training methodology to Harmon Beale, administrator, deceased, and not one page, not the earliest memo, not the oldest photograph's caption, not even a footnote, mentioned a name his grandfather had said to him, more times over more dinners than Austin could count. He sat with that for a long moment, the trailer's window fan turning slow circles of warm air, and thought about every story his grandfather had ever told him about the Ridge, about a handler who'd kept a whole unit's dogs breathing through something that had gone wrong on a training ground decades back, a story his grandfather always told the same way and never finished the same way twice. He'd always assumed the handler in those stories was someone lost to history, the way most soldiers are lost to history, a name too small for anyone to have bothered writing down. He hadn't considered, until this exact moment, standing in a trailer with a folder in his hands, that the name might have been left out on purpose, by someone else, for reasons that had nothing to do with the man's importance, and everything to do with what was easiest to build a story around once he was inconvenient to include in it. He carried the folder out into the afternoon light, meaning to find Havermeyer, and found instead, coming across the gravel lot toward him at a pace too brisk for the heat, Elise Beaumont, phone already pressed to her ear, telling someone that the general's car was running badly behind schedule and that someone needed to figure out, fast, what they were going to do about the closing remarks. General Marion Kirkendall's driver called it in from 40 minutes out, weather having turned the 2-lane county road into a slow crawl of brake lights, and by the time Elise relayed the news to the stage manager, it was clear the general would not make the podium before the broadcast's 6 o'clock cutoff, not for his closing remarks, not for anything. Austin volunteered to call him directly, mostly because nobody else in the trailer seemed to want to be the one holding a phone with a general's name on the screen, and because some instinct in him, still unformed but insistent, wanted to ask the man a question that had nothing to do with the schedule at all. He stepped out near the rope line to get a signal, the folder still under his arm, and when his grandfather's voice came through, steady, a little tired, apologizing before Austin could even explain the delay, Austin found himself asking, before he'd planned to ask anything, whether his grandfather had ever known a man named Floyd Renfro. There was a silence on the line long enough that Austin thought the call had dropped. "Where are you standing right now?" the general said instead of answering, and something in his voice had gone very careful, the way a man's voice goes careful when a question he never expected to hear finally arrives 40 years late. Austin told him about the gate, the 6 dogs, the low whistle nobody else had noticed, the folder crediting a dead man for something his grandfather had described 100 times over as belonging to somebody else entirely. He held the phone out then, almost without deciding to, toward Havermeyer, who had come up beside him drawn by the same instinct that draws men toward conversations they suspect are about to cost them something, and put it on speaker so the small crowd gathered near the rope, Elise, a stage tech, 2 of the handlers still calming their dogs, could hear what came next. 40 years ago, General Kirkendall said, his voice carrying thin and clear through the phone's small speaker. There was a line rupture on a training ground I won't name over an open call. Gas venting into a kennel row faster than anybody's protocol accounted for. I was 26 years old and I froze. I want that said plainly, because I've let people assume otherwise for 4 decades. I froze, and a handler I outranked on paper and not in any way that mattered went into that row without waiting on an order, and brought out every animal in it, and then came back for the 2 junior handlers still inside, trying to do what I should have already ordered them to do. "That handler's name is Floyd Renfro," he asked, after that his name be kept off the incident report and off every roster the program ever printed again, because the way it would have read on paper was that a green lieutenant nearly got 2 men and 11 dogs killed standing still, and he didn't want that lieutenant's whole career built on a story like that before it started. I kept my commission because of a silence he asked for and never once collected on. My grandson has a place in this program today because I had a career at all to hand down an interest in. I'd call that a debt, except Floyd never once let anyone call it that to his face. The rope line had gone very quiet by the time the general finished, quiet in a way that had nothing rehearsed in it at all. Havermeyer stood with the phone's light reflecting faint against his face, his printed run sheet hanging forgotten at his side, and for the first time all day he did not have a sentence ready to fill the silence with. Havermeyer walked the length of the rope line himself to reach him, which was, in its own quiet way, the first honest thing he had done all afternoon, since a lesser man in his position would have sent someone else to make the walk for him. He didn't offer his hand right away. He stood in front of Floyd with the printed run sheet still folded in one fist, looked at it as if seeing it for the first time, and then set it down on the nearest folding table, face up, where the crowd could see the crossed-out line where Harmon Beale's name had been. "I've got about an hour before the wall gets poured," he said. "I can write it again. I need you to tell me what it should say, because I don't have the right words for it, and pretending I do is most of how we got here." Floyd looked at him for a long moment, the way a man looks at weather, before deciding whether to trust it, and then reached inside his jacket, slow, and unbuttoned the pocket that had stayed closed since before sunrise. He drew the strap out into the open air for the first time that day, its long, uneven row of tick marks catching the low afternoon light, and held it not toward Havermeyer, but toward nothing in particular, the way a man sets an object down for everyone to see, rather than hands it to any one person. 40 years ago, there was a line rupture on a training ground, he said, and his voice carried further than a man his age had any right to expect it to carry, because the field had gone that still. 11 dogs in that row, 2 young handlers still inside past when they should have been out. I went in because going in was the job, not because I was owed anything for it after. One of those handlers was scared enough that night that he'd have carried it the rest of his life if the report had read the way it should have read, plain, complete, naming exactly how close it came. I asked that my name come off it instead, not because I did nothing, because I'd already done what I came to do, and his whole career was still ahead of him, and mine had already had its good years. He ran his thumb once down the row of marks, an old habit finishing an old sentence. "Every one of these is a dog I brought home. I never counted the men, because the men count themselves, in their own ledgers, in their own time. I only ever kept a private tally of the animals, because nobody else was keeping one, and somebody should." Austin, standing at the edge of the small crowd with the folder still under his arm, understood then, all at once and completely, that every story his grandfather had ever told him at a kitchen table about the ridge had been about the man standing in front of him now, and that the reason the story never finished the same way twice was that his grandfather had never once been able to say the ending out loud without naming a debt Floyd had spent 40 years refusing to let anyone call by that word. The crowd held its silence a while longer, the kind of silence that isn't waiting for anything else to be said, only sitting with what already has been. "I don't want my name over anybody's on that wall," Floyd said finally, plain as a man reading a grocery list. "Put the dogs' names where they belong. Put mine down among the handlers, same size, same line. That's the only thing I came here to ask for, and I didn't even come here to ask for that." Havermeyer picked the run sheet back up, turned it over to its blank side, and began, right there at the folding table with the broadcast camera's red light still burning nearby, to write. The wall was cast that evening on schedule, and stood the following spring exactly as Havermeyer had redrafted it in the last hour before the pour, a long bronze plate naming, in a single unbroken column and identical lettering, every handler and every animal the program had ever lost or retired, no name set larger or higher than another, Floyd Renfro's own name resting midway down the column, the way any name rests when nobody has decided it deserves more room than the ones beside it. Beside the wall, mounted in a small glass case the foundation had built without being asked, the tally strap hung at rest, uncounted further, its long row of tick marks catching whatever light came through the case's low window. Next to it sat a hand-lettered card, plain and small, bearing no explanation and no dates, only a name. Because by then, everyone who needed to understand what the strap had counted already did, and everyone who didn't could ask, and would be told plainly, by whoever happened to be standing nearby that day. He didn't ask to be remembered. He only asked that the dogs be. Months later, on a quiet evening, after the last of the season's ceremonies had folded their chairs and gone home, Floyd walked the drill field's edge, with Alder at his side, the old dog's gait slower now than it had been even that spring, both of them content with a pace that asked nothing of either. The light had gone the soft gold color it goes at the far end of a long day, and the field, emptied of its crowds and its cameras, had returned to being only grass and fence wire, and the particular quiet of a place that has done its work for the day and can rest. In the truck bed under the hackberry, the case of honey jars from Wanda's hives sat one lighter than it had started that morning, the rest handed out to families as they'd filed past on their way to their cars, taken with the kind of quiet thanks people offer when they don't fully know what they're thanking a man for, only that it feels right to thank him. Some names get poured into bronze. The truer ones get carried on a strap, counted in silence, by the one man who never asked for either. Floyd walked the field's far edge until the light gave out, his dog beside him, the wall behind them, holding its column of names steady in the dusk, and neither of them looked back to check that it was still standing there. They already knew,